It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome, Quiller Nation, to this very exciting episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, where I am joined by my two favorite guests of the program, both at the same time. And I believe that they coordinated this just so that neither of them can hold the title for who has been guest the most times, because this way they both actually add one to their total. But here I have with me, of course, our dear friend, Dr. Earl Showerman, and my lovely wife, Annie Sable.
Hello, Quillers.
Hey, Quillers. Good to hear you, Stephen, and glad to be here again.
Always, Earl. It's always great to be with you. And this time we have something really incredible to talk about, which is your book that's now been out for a few months. About almost 6 months now, or a little longer, maybe?
It was published in June on my wife's birthday.
Yeah.
And dedicated to Lee also.
Oh, well, fantastic. She must be very proud.
Well, she was. And she said, there's no love in that dedication. So I had to handwrite in a love message on top of the dedication that's actually published in the book. But it was really her inspiration, almost 20 years ago, after I had begun diving into this and I'd written a few papers. She said, you're going to have to write the book. And that 20 years later became a prophetic realization.
That's fantastic. Well, she definitely has been your muse for quite some time in your life, hasn't she?
Oh, well, she's been supporting me in so many ways that can't possibly be accounted for by, feeding me and allowing me the freedom to travel and to buy books and to really go over the top and endless rounds of theater tickets at various festivals.
I can relate as my wife sits here laughing right next to us. Yeah. Well, the book is called Shakespeare's Greater Greek. They can find it on Amazon, correct?
That's correct. It is published through KDP Publishing. That's an Amazon arm of self-publishing industry.
We brought our copy along with us today so that it could get properly signed. But it has traveled halfway around the world, because when Annie and I were in Europe not too long ago, we took it with us so that we could fight over it on the airplane, the long airplane flights. And then, of course, Annie, there were some times when we had some moments on the beach in Cannes and in Savona along the Ligurian Sea. And there was my wife laying there in her beautiful bathing suit under the sun, reading Dr. Earl Showerman for all the world to see. So it's one of the reasons why she's here with us today, because I am familiar with several of the pieces in the book, because we've actually done episodes on some of that work.
We have, yes.
But for her, some of it was a lot of new territory. Some of it was new territory for me, but a lot of it was new territory for her. And she was like, "Oh, I really want to ask him about this and that and the other thing." And I said, "Well, that's a great idea for an episode." So here we are. And that being said, I'm going to let Annie start with some of her questions, because I think that's going to make the more interesting episode. Not only that, but the audience gets tired of listening to me. So here you are, my love.
Thank you. And thank you for the most part, letting me win the battle for the book, because I pretty much monopolized it for a lot of the trip. It's mine. I'm interested. I want to read it. So that being said, I think I'm mostly curious, Earl, to know how it all began for you. Like, what inspires you to, obviously know your great interest in Shakespeare, but to go down this specific niche of, wanting to know more about the Greek influence. How did that all begin for you?
Oh, thank you so much for asking, Anna, because it is a good story. I mean, I'm in my 30s and 40s. While I was still practicing emergency medicine, I began reading more poetry, and Greek epic actually interested me. And so I took classes in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Nikos Kazantzakis' wonderful book, The Odyssey, a Modern Sequel, occupied my reading for a whole summer. So I was kind of oriented toward the Greek way of thinking about things and the Greek histories and epics when I began my retirement. And I had been going up to Concordia University, where Dan Wright would run the Edward de Vere Studies Conference each April. And because I I had gotten a hold of Charlton Ogburn's book back in the 80s. And at the time, as I was approaching my retirement, I thought, well, I really want to learn more about this whole authorship question. And by wonderful happenstance, Concordia University was sponsoring a series of yearly Shakespeare Oxford programs focused on Edward de Vere as Shakespeare. And it was there that I heard wonderful speakers that are still with us, like Roger Strittmatter and, Charles Beauclerc and other wonderful, Kevin Gilvary, who came to Concordia and spoke. And so it was there that I heard a presentation around year 2000, so just a couple years before my retirement, by an undergraduate by the name of Andrew Worth. And Andy was a student there, a junior in his studies, and he had been set on the path of studying the Greek influence on Shakespeare and how it had been neglected for the better part of a century. That most commentaries dating back to the early 20th century suggested that Shakespeare was not at all familiar with untranslated Greek sources, such as the Greek epic and the Greek plays, which were never published in England during Shakespeare's lifetime until Chapman translated the Iliad in the early 17th century. So most of that canon was supposedly unfamiliar to people who live in England, unless, of course, you were living in Cecil House where all those Greek editions existed. Okay. So Annie made a great case that Shakespeare invented words that were based on Greek roots, that his names of characters oftentimes had Greek resonances. He identified the Greek anthology as a source for sonnets 153 and 154 for the love, sonnets that with Cupid's torch and all being extinguished by the maidens, and that so he really covered the board in terms of opening up the great question of how scholars had basically ignored or been in denial about the influence of Greek literature, the untranslated Greek literature on Shakespeare. Of course, we know that Plutarch's Lies was a great inspiration for so many of the plays, the Roman tragedies certainly, and that Shakespeare was familiar with other translated and Latin sources, but the Greek sources were remote. For instance, nobody thought that he had any contact with any Platonic dialogues, but we have good proof that he actually probably was. So when you start looking at the canon, the context and the plots of the canon, you see Greek parallels. Well, in 2003, I retired from my 40 year career in medicine and immediately started taking Shakespeare classes at the university here. And it has a great library, the Hannon Library, and those of you who have visited Ashland in the past would know about this. It had over 8,000 Shakespeare-related titles and journals and variorum editions that go back, printed 100 years ago, on the shelf that you could check out. I mean, it was amazing as a resource. And so in my second Shakespeare class, my instructor, Liz Eckhart, was just a brilliant teacher. And she asked some good questions that I ended up having to go to office hours to explain to her. She asked, first of all, what about the poisoning of the ear? Where did that come from? Well, we know, for those of us who had studied something about Shakespeare's medical knowledge, that the assassination of the Duke of Urbino about 1535 was by his cousin by the name of Gonzaga, who rubbed a poisonous potion into his ear and murdered the Duke. So there was actually a historical precedent. So I took that to my instructor, and she was impressed. The next week, she asked about the darn pirates, and why would Shakespeare ever use pirates to create the turnaround in Hamlet's destiny?
The pirates are one of my favorites.
Yes, yeah.
Well, by pure serendipity, that very day, the Shakespeare Oxford newsletter arrived, and the lead article was Christopher Paul's explanation of the pirates in Hamlet and the word naked that came up over and over again in historical documents describing how the Earl of Oxford was robbed by these Dutch pirates and stripped bare and set on the shore. And so I had a document, and I could explain to her why it was the pirates in Hamlet that were part of the story and why the word naked came up over and over again in the letters Hamlet sent to Claudius and to Horatio. So I had to go to her office in office hours, and I brought a copy of that newsletter and handed it over. And I said, now you will know I'm outed as an Oxfordian. And she looked up at me and she said, fantastic.
Oh, awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was such a blessing. Just the light in her eyes of meeting an Oxfordian. She had never met anybody who knew anything about the authorship question. She was a Reed graduate and had done graduate studies, but she wasn't a tenured track faculty member, but she was such a dynamic and wonderful teacher. She's still teaching 25 years later down at the university, so she still maintains her thing, but she gave me the green light. And I said, well, the parallels between Hamlet and the Oresteia, of Aeschylus and Euripides' plays on Orestes, and the assassination of the king by the queen and her lover, and then the retribution of the son coming back, and there must be a parallel. There must be something that maybe connects Shakespeare with the Greek original, trilogies and plays of Euripides and Sophocles. And so she said, "You go for it." So I went to the library. And I entered 2 words in the search engine, Hamlet, Orestes. I hit enter. And my life since that moment has been completely changed, okay? Because I came up with a 2014 pamphlet, 50-page pamphlet by Gilbert Murray, England's foremost Greek translator and teacher at Oxford University, Hamlet and Orestes, A Study in Types. And he did all the work for me. He had the knowledge of the entire Greek canon and could find details of the text of Hamlet that were paralleled from the Greek sources. And he was astonished that there was no way to explain this because these plays had not been published, translated or published in England. There were Latin translations, certainly extant from publishing houses on the continent, but there had been nothing published in England that related to the Orestes dramas of either Euripides, Sophocles, or Aeschylus. And so he said there must be some archetypal transmission of tragical types. And that's why Shakespeare kind of picked up on the same themes that affected Aeschylus, that there was no direct literary connection, but it's hard to believe there wasn't. He said, there must be a connection somewhere.
Sure.
And I'm lit up.
Yeah.
I'm so lit up. I mean,
So wait a minute, the authors just tap into the mothership of character types and create similar characters by chance, by just accident. That was the idea.
That was the idea.
That's what I'm hearing as well. Yeah.
And of course, he says that no one believes that Shakespeare used these Greek sources. In the current scholars at the turn of the century that he was writing. And Robert Root, who wrote a book on Shakespeare and the Classics and published in 1904. Said there's no chance he ever had any contact, any inspiration whatsoever from the Greek drama. So they would take these absolute positions against the Greek drama being an influence on Shakespeare. Well, that fires up a heart of a guy like me.
Sure.
I mean, I'm an emergency doctor, and I base my decision-making on evidence, not eminence.
Right.
What I learned in school doesn't serve me 40 years later when I'm still in practice, So I said, this is fabulous. And I found other sources in that library that confirmed that Shakespeare was familiar with the Greek tragical canon regarding the creation of Hamlet.
Sure.
I just not too long ago had an episode with Professor Nick Pangopoulos of the University of Athens, and we talk all about Plato's influence on Shakespeare. And here's a man who teaches at the University of Athens, is obviously fluent in Greek and English as well, obviously. He's a Shakespearean scholar, as well as a scholar of philosophy. And he points out over and over again how Shakespeare developed a lot of his philosophical ideas from obviously reading Plato, and how they pop up over and over again in the works, especially King Lear was one of the ones that we really focused on in the episode.
Yeah, I know Nick. I've never met in person, but we've been on Zoom together and corresponded. He helped edit my book. Okay, so we're and his English grammar was better than mine. I have to admit it. Nick, you killed it. And he wrote a nice tribute at the beginning. To promote the book. So yes, his work looking at the Platonic influence on Hamlet and the other plays in the canon is going to be very significant and and he's one of several Greek scholars that are looking at the influence of Greek epic and Greek drama on Shakespeare. So he's not alone in this, but he's definitely out there. And it was great that he got to meet Roger Strittmatter when he came to our conference of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship in October or September, and in New Haven. And Roger, who has been working on Greek editions that found that oddly end with annotations in a Roman history of Cassius Dio that were written in the handwriting of the Earl of Oxford in Latin and Greek commentaries and marginalia.
Wow.
So the fact that he met Roger and has been in contact with me, and the publication of my book supports what he has been working on himself. So
Sure.
it really does spread to a whole new level, the influence of Greek drama. Now, when you talk about Plato and Shakespeare, the Earl of Oxford bought a Plato in folio edition when he was 19 years old.
Wow.
He acquired the Plato at the same time that he got the Geneva Bible, his copy of Chaucer, and his Amiot's translation of Plutarch's Lives. So we know at the age of 19, the Earl of Oxford was being exposed to deep Greek philosophy and Greek literature. And of course, Plutarch is a great entry into all sorts of stuff. But he had been studying the Greek Bible. William Wright, the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, I think Lewis Wright, whatever his name is, he wrote a book about certain precepts, about William Cecil's precepts. And he said that on Sundays, the wards that were living with Cecil, and we know the Earl of Oxford lived as a ward under Cecil's house for almost a decade, among other scholars and other people, including Henry Risley, that they would read the Greek Bible on Sunday in Greek.
Really?
And so he was studying the Greek biblical literature as well as, the translation of Plato, which may have been a parallel translation, Latin and Greek, because that was a very common way in which continental editions were published, comparing Latin and Greek on opposite pages.
Sure.
Because the Greek lettering was so different, there were no presses in England that could publish significant amount of original Greek material. I think there might have been one or two Greek editions that were published in England, but it was extremely rare compared to the publishing houses on the continent.
But they were publishing that type of material from the printing presses in Venice.
In Venice?
And had been for almost 100 years already by that point.
Yes. The Vittori translation of Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia, is probably Shakespeare's source. Certainly, the shortened version that was in the possession of Ben Jonson was a translation of the Oresteia. Did not have any of the Agamemnon in it. Actually, it only had the latter two plays of the trilogy in the one that he had. But the Vittori edition had the complete text, which is probably Shakespeare's source, because he obviously, well, in my mind, he obviously used that source not only for Hamlet, but also for Macbeth, which was a stunning realization when I saw a production at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival while we were actually reading the Oresteia at a lifelong learning program that I was attending at the university. And the 12 parallels that I noted while I was in the theater, I went home and at midnight, I'm writing down all the parallels in imagery and plot and metaphor and dramaturgy that I saw between the original source, the Aeschylus's Oresteia, and Macbeth was stunning, and that set me on a whole new path. That took me another 6 months of research and looking at what scholars had said about Macbeth, and realizing it had a powerful influence. The same source as that, definitely, I think. And other scholars have agreed that Hamlet was influenced by the Greek drama. Louise Schleiner, who was a professor at Washington State, published in 1990 in the Shakespeare Quarterly an article on this. And she says, I find it very hard to believe that the scene at the graveyard with the gravedigger and the burial of Ophelia was not based on the Oresteia's Electra, where where Orestes and Pylades, his sidekick, Horatio and Hamlet, are hiding behind a tomb and then come forward to be identified. And the parallels, she says, are unmistakable. And she thinks that Hamlet is much more an Orestes kind of character than an Oedipus. He's much more likely to kill his mother than to want to make love to her.
Oh, I agree completely.
Yeah.
And I was kicking myself having, read your book on our recent vacation that I hadn't at least read the Hamlet section prior to playing Hamlet this summer, which I did in June, because it was very interesting to read about the parallels between the Oresteia and Hamlet. Especially, I was like digging back into the nether regions of my brain. I hadn't, even really thought about the Oresteia since college when we read the Oresteia, and I saw some productions that are, I wasn't involved in any of them, but saw some productions it was Agamemnon and the Libation Bearers that the school had done. So I was like digging back into my brain to go, okay, yes, I remember some of this, but then kicking myself for not taking the time to go and read your commentary on it, and then also, okay, now I should have actually looked at the Oresteia again before jumping into it. I would have loved doing that. So I'm like, sad I missed that. But regardless, very interesting to read. How familiar with the Oresteia were you prior to diving into that connection with Hamlet? Like, were you already very educated on it?
I had read it in college.
Okay,
yeah.
So similar to me, yeah.
I took a class in that studied the Greek epic and also some drama. But can you imagine the Earl of Oxford sitting there reading the Greek and realizing that he has an opportunity to rebirth something that's been dead for 2,000 years.
Right, exactly.
I mean, to bring back to the stage those narratives and those images and that plot that, is so compelling that came out of the classical tradition. I mean, the Oresteia is the only extant trilogy we have.
Yes.
Can you just imagine the satisfaction, the pleasure, the excitement of realizing that he's digging down and doing that perfect, mimetic exercise of great Renaissance writing, which included incorporating classical themes, classical narratives, classical plots with medieval stories and with the modern, Renaissance narratives that were being created by people like Robert Greene, Tom Nash, and others.
Right.
That he could tee off of, also bringing all that together.
Well, and it's incredible how you connect, the influence of the Greek tragedy, but also, for that time period, the modern day the current events, right? The connection to what we call his history now, obviously, but that was going on right at that time, talking about the situation with the Mary Queen of Scots and connecting that all together. That was fascinating for me to read. I know, Stephen, you wanted to jump in there and say something, but...
Well, as it was always Oxford's way to do, he then takes it and magnifies it, because what he does is he gives Hamlet that one of the best scenes in all of dramatic literature is the closet scene with Hamlet and Gertrude.
Right.
He gives Hamlet the opportunity to do what Orestes never gets to do, which is to confront his mother verbally and to tell her off and to say to her, because you think of Orestes in Clytemnestra, he never really gets to lambast her the way that Hamlet gets to lambast Gertrude, but that feeling of betrayal is still there, right?
Yeah.
Well, and again, what does Orestes do? Well, he and his sister slay their mother, whereas here, Hamlet ultimately forgives Gertrude by the end of it. Especially at the end when he kisses her after she's dead, is a really wonderful moment near the end of the play. But when you then look at the Earl of Oxford's life and how he felt about his mother and how betrayed he felt about his mother rushing off to marry another man after the death of his father, and it just layer upon layer upon layer happens there, right? It's really an intense connection.
Yeah, no, the parallels are unmistakably rich and deep, but I think the foundation of most of my research is independent of the Earl of Oxford's involvement. We do know that he lived in a household where the Greek drama existed. Mildred Cecil was a renowned Greek translator, and she had the editions of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides in her personal library and made donations of some of those texts to the more elite grammar school like Westminster, where Ben Jonson attended, and Eton and other places that had more aristocratic connections and had Greek educators who could actually teach Greek. Merchant Taylor's Company, they had scholarship for students that had studied Greek that went off to Oxford and to Cambridge. But to realize that you're bringing a 2,000-year-old lost tradition back to life.
Yeah.
and over again, you see the plays parallels within the Shakespeare canon, and then the imagery, and it just lays on a whole deeper, richer understanding of what brings poetic inspiration and what brings genius to the fore that could understand and write and read in Greek, which is pretty well established for the Earl of Oxford. I mean, he attended the Greek church in Venice, where the liturger was St. John Chrysostom. Incidentally, his wife did receive an anonymous translation of St. John Chrysostom's sermons in 1581 in December, the same moment that she and the Earl of Oxford were reunited after their 5-year estrangement.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was one of the 5 literary dedications she received. Most of them were related to religious matters, and Chrysostom's text was involved in actually 2 of those dedications. But then she also received George Baker's dedication, The New Jewel of Health, which was a medical text, translation of the Paracelsus Conrad Gessner's publication on the continent. It was basically a translation of Gessner, dedicated to Anne Cecil.
Wow.
And of course, the Earl of Oxford also received dedications from George Baker, the Queen's surgeon, and John Hester, the most prominent apothecary in London at the time, and publishing translations of Paracelsus. So the medical connections and all that were really deep, and that was one area of interest that I pursued.
Right.
When the question came up, what about Shakespeare's medical knowledge? What can you say about that?
You gotta dive deep into that part for sure.
Oh, no.
I gotta say, I was obviously reading the Hamlet connection to the Oresteia was very intriguing for me, but I loved the connection that you drew between Clytemnestra and Lady Macbeth when you were looking at the connections between the Oresteia and Macbeth. Yeah. And I know you and Stephen have done an episode before, kind of talking about the bird connection to Macbeth and how that is drawn from the Greek influence, but I had not noticed anything too much connecting the Oresteia to Macbeth before, but that was really awesome to read and revisit again in my brain. Okay, yes, I do. Somewhere in there, I do have those connections to the Greek tragedies, and I can reconnect that.
Well, the poison breast theme comes up twice, and then a smashing of the head and plucking from the nipple and turn my milk to gall.
Yes.
Yeah, and Clytemnestra's dream of being bitten by the breast by a snake who was her son. Coming to seek redemption. The idea that both women had to have candles lit at night, and had night terrors.
Yes.
The house speaking, and the display of bloody knives and the night net that was used to trap Agamemnon.
Yeah, all of that was wonderful.
Yeah, it was like hitting me on the head when I was sitting in the theater and getting more and more excited because I could appreciate having a fresh memory of all those images and plot elements that were in the Oresteia and seeing them in the production of Macbeth in a way. And you realize when you read the criticisms of Macbeth that go back a couple hundred years in the Variorum editions, many scholars would say, oh, this is the most classical of all. This is the most Greek-like. It's almost like Aeschylus is looking over his shoulder while he was writing the play. I think Lord Campbell said something to that effect. But it was like they saw it. They knew there was a connection somehow. They couldn't tie it together because they were familiar with the history of publication and what was available in England and what traditional scholars had recognized within the Shakespeare canon. But Macbeth is so imprinted by that Greek story. And, the Greek tragedies, the Greek comedies, they were political, And the other thing that you mentioned, of course, is the connection between Mary, Queen of Scots and the story of Hamlet and Macbeth actually relating in some direct way with what her fate was.
Right.
And if you realize that, she was under investigation for almost 20 years from the time she left the throne in Scotland and escaped to England, became basically a prisoner of Queen Elizabeth, being shuttled around between various castles and given a decent life, but given no chance to ascend to power. And the plot to support her and then to usurp Elizabeth, and looking at the details of how the beer barrel was used to transmit the secret messages back and forth.
Sure.
And there's a mention of the bunghole beer barrel stopper in Hamlet. It's like, oh, come on. He put that in there because the Earl of Oxford was sitting in 1587 during the trial of Mary Queen of Scots, in which she was convicted of treason and then later beheaded. And then, of course, that begins the Spanish-English War in 1588 with the launch of the Armada. And in 1589, you have a reference to Hamlet.
Right.
So you have a first version of Hamlet, maybe what's come to us as Q1, the kind of crude, half-written, not quite so refined version that was written maybe hastily in the immediate aftermath of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots and the launch of a long 15-year war with Spain that would, drive up inflation and make the English public suffer quite a bit, along the way. So I do think that Shakespeare's story of certainly in Hamlet reflects on the quandary of what to do about Mary Queen of Scots, who wanted to usurp Elizabeth and claim the throne.
So when doing all of this research and you're talking about kind of having these lightning bolt moments, right? Seeing the plays, doing the studies, was it always your intent to then start, writing these pieces, these papers, and eventually obviously compiling them into this book? Or did it start just as kind of, I'm intrigued by this and I want to learn more?
I think the latter. I didn't plan on doing a survey of the canon in the beginning, but you get affected by things along the way. And I have to say, one of the moments of revelation in this whole history of my involvement with Shakespeare occurred during a production of The Winter's Tale way back in the late 70s when we first moved to Ashland and we saw a production of it. And during the statue scene, it was an impeccable production with James Edmondson playing the very contrite Leontes in the latter part of it. So you really actually do believe that his penance, his 16 years, may have cured him of the paranoia and violence who he is portrayed in the first couple acts of the play. And the sense of redemption was so fulfilling that when they unveiled the throne and the perfect actress who was playing Hermione begins to move, the whole audience is gasping in exaltation, and they're playing Pachelbel's canon in D. Okay.
Right.
So the hearts are open and sobbing. All around me are the audience members who were unfamiliar, like I was, with the miracle return of a queen you thought dead for so long, and were being entertained by a little pastoral Act 3.
Right.
And now you're back there and you're honoring the integrity and the beauty and the perfection of her, in contrast to the paranoia and the terrible things that Leontes had done early on, for which he's being forgiven, and the return of Perdita and all that. And the whole audience is in an exalted state when they leave the theater. And that was it. After that, I had to see everything he wrote. I had to try to understand the miracle behind it. Well, when I was first doing my Shakespeare studies and I'd written my Hamlet paper, one of my colleagues, a friend, a physician named Marilee Carr, who was a regular at the Concordia Conference, sent me a review of a production of the Alcestis performed at the Greek theater, classical Greek theater at Reed College. There was a group that would put on the traditional Greek theater in an open arena, kind of like
that's awesome.
Little Athens there. And the reviewer said, this is remarkably like the conclusion of the scene of The Winter's Tale. I wonder if Euripides, was proved inspiration for Shakespeare. Well, that can you believe that triggered me? Okay.
Right, yes, I'm shocked.
So I'm down there at Hannon Library and I pull out the Variorum edition. And I find that in 1858, scholars were giving a deep dive on the parallels of the of Euripides' tragicomedy, the Alcestis, with the concluding statue scene of The Winter's Tale. And I went to a lecture at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival during that season, and the man throws up a portrait of Elizabeth Farren playing Hermione that was painted in 1780s by Johann Zoffani. Elizabeth Farren was a famous actress on Drury Lane, later the Countess of Derby, actually, playing Hermione, and she's leaning on a pedestal with images from Euripides' Alcestis.
Oh, I love it.
A lower bas relief that shows Hercules wrestling with death to free the queen who's supposed to have died, and then returning her to the king, holding hands and veiled. So the dramaturgy of that production in 1780s showed the Greek root. it was clear that some people understood this
Yes.
early on,
Yeah.
who were familiar with the classics. And then you get to the 20th century, and not one not one edition of The Winter's Tale mentions Euripides' Alcestis as a source.
So it just got shut down after that.
But look at the name origins. I mean, it's all right there. Leontes, Hermione, Perdita. I mean, when you look at it, it's like it's so clear as day.
Yes.
But they got clouded by the mythology of the Stratford man, which said that it's not possible. And to
Right.
them, they're like, well, this isn't possible, so it just can't be. We're imagining these connections. They can't actually be real, right?
That's exactly the way it's described by so many scholars. AD, not all, the Martindales, they all writing, really even into the 1990s, how little Shakespeare must have been influenced by the Greek drama. We don't have one instance, they say, not one instance. So the overstatement, the ridiculous rejection of all influence is a red flag.
Yes.
You know they're lying.
Yes.
You know they haven't looked underneath the bed sheets. And my book is a lot about lifting those bed sheets and looking underneath there. Okay. So
Wait, it's Greek, not Roman.
Oh, okay, all
Toga? There's a toga party you were holding there?
well, we love the Symposium. Okay. So the Earl of Oxford gets a copy of Plato's Symposium, whether it was a Latin translation or an original Greek, we don't know. But he's reading it at 19. And of course, it's a great party, and all the important people of Athens are right there. I mean, Aristophanes is there, Agathon, who wrote the tragic, Socrates is there, Alcibiades is there, Phaedrus, all these famous characters that come down to us are all at the Symposium, and at the very end of the night of drinking and describing various aspects of love. And Alcestis, of course, gets mentioned. Phaedrus says she is the perfect example of love, who is willing to sacrifice her life for her king, for that her children will have a father, and not be unprotected.
Right.
That was her motivation for accepting the death. And they said, this is an example of love. Well, every one of the different members gives various explanations about love. And Socrates talks about what Diotima, his female instructor, his mentor, taught him about love from the female standpoint. Well, at the very end of the night, everybody's passed out except for Socrates, Agathon, and Aristophanes. Mm-hmm. And Socrates is saying, well, it's about time for me to go, but I have to tell you this. It's so great that you can write such wonderful comedies, Eris. It's so great that the tragedies are so good, Agathon, and congratulations on winning the prize this year. But the greatest playwrights could write both comedies and tragedies.
Yeah.
And here's this 19-year-old, highly impressionable genius who's already, received a number of book dedications, going back to the time he was 14 years old, an acknowledged serious student of history and literature, getting this infusion of brilliant, Platonic dialogue and invoking the sex that the best people can write from both the tragical and the comical point of views. And can you do that?
Right.
Well,
yeah.
That was the
we
challenge.
Know he can.
We
Yeah.
did it. Yeah.
So that's great. I love that you started talking about the parallel between the Alcestis and the Winter's Tale. That was a fascinating read for me. I'm not familiar at all with the Alcestis, so now I'm intrigued to go dive a little deep into that, figure out how more about that. But did you then instantly also create the connection between the Alcestis and Much Ado About Nothing? 'Cause that was a great part of your book as well. I loved that.
You taking me back to 2006. So 2006, we had the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship or Shakespeare Fellowship and Shakespeare Oxford Society had a joint conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And that was during a time in which the Royal Shakespeare Company, starring Patrick Stewart, was in performance and in Ann Arbor. So we got tickets to see Patrick Stewart playing Prospero and Mark Antony. Mm-hmm. And we also saw a great production of Julius Caesar. And it was all Royal Shakespeare Company, 3 nights in a row. We got to the theater, and Patrick Stewart actually came to our conference and spoke about playing Prospero.
Oh, how awesome.
And I got a signature on the program.
Oh, that's
I'm
incredible.
the only one. I chased him out of the auditorium. and
I believe it.
I ran him down. I was responsible for introducing him. So I had some authority to waylay him in the hallway as he was trying to escape our clutches. But he's a true believer in tradition. He would go to
Yes.
Stratford and go to Holy Trinity Church and pray for inspiration for his roles. So he wasn't offended by the fact that we represented a group of people who had some doubts about that attribution and all. But he spoke very compellingly, and they did a wonderful rendition of The Tempest as a Northern Inuit style of
very interesting.
production, and it was brilliantly played out, and we all thoroughly enjoyed the show. So afterwards, you go down to the pub, and I was sitting there with Professor Brian Bechtold and one of his students, Stuart Green, and we're sipping on our pints of ale and reveling in the fact that we've just had such great experiences because of coming to that conference and having the good joss to see Royal Shakespeare Company productions that were absolutely brilliant. And he said, well, Earl, have you thought about Much Ado? A similar kind of ending. What do you think? Oh my God. Yeah, you're right. Well, that sent me back to the library.
Yes.
Okay.
Of course.
And that came up with probably one of my most original pieces, because not only is that final statue scene very similar to the final scene with Hero and Claudio and them being reunited and the unveiling of the surprising she's still alive, story. But the tomb scene in Much Ado, where she's memorialized, and the chanting that went on there has a direct parallel to Choric scene at the conclusion of the Alcestis, right before the unveiling and the return of Alcestis, with Hercules guiding her back to life in the world. And so I was able to enhance and add to the identification of Much Ado as likely to be inspired by Euripides' Alcestis, and that this adds to what we already recognize within the statue scene parallels to the Claudio Hero marriage, but the actual tomb scenes have almost direct literary parallels to a Choric passages. And a few years later, Gale Publications contacted me and asked if I could include that Much Ado article with their collection of essays on Much Ado About Nothing.
Yes.
And one of the other contributing editors to that edition in 2012 was Clare McKeekern, who was the editor of the Ard edition. That was one of my primary sources. So my idea was an original addition to an existing recognition that Much Ado probably was also inspired by the Alcestis. And now there are a number of scholars that pretty much accept Euripides as being a Shakespeare source in a variety of plays, as Hecuba, in addition to Iphigenia at Aulis, and the Alcestis being among those. And a wonderful scholar at Yale University, where she received her PhD, Tanya Pollard, now a professor at Brooklyn College, wrote a book, Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages, in which she deeply dives into this whole question of Euripides as a Shakespearean source and really proves the case.
He really loves that theme too, because we see it again, not quite to the same extent, but we see it again in Pericles.
And in All's Well.
With the reunion. And then we see it again in All's Well. And I wonder if we're not seeing a continual repeat of the reunion of Oxford and Anne Cecil after their 6-year separation, when he returns from the continent and disavows her and rejects her and the baby. And then, 6 years later, they reunite. And we see this again and again through multiple plays, where you could argue that these female characters are a representation of her. And in the case of Pericles, of her and the child. In the case of Winter's Tale, of her and the daughter. You have two instances here of mother and daughter reuniting with the king, the husband. And so I wonder, when you see that, again, it's a layer upon layer upon layer, right?
Yes. You've got to add, absolutely, Stephen. In fact, because the Oregon Shakespeare Festival was putting on a production of Pericles, I dove into that, and I saw that as a direct parallel to Winter's Tale, and that Artemis, Diana, is the goddess, and Apollo is the goddess that's revered and actually appears in the concluding scene of Pericles at her temple, and gives the blessing, and through the mother who becomes the head of the temple at Ephesus, and that Apollo is the god that guides the Winter's Tale, that is behind so much. There's more Apollonian references in Winter's Tale than in any other play, and so I think this is like a brother-sister thing, where Artemis and Apollo, as brother and sister, are involved in similar stories of the alienation of the father from the daughter and the wife, and the reunion of the father and the daughter and the wife at the end. That he wrote two plays that had very similar romantic qualities and comparable endings, both based on different sources. I mean, John Gower's story is not connected in any direct way that I know to Greek literature, which was Shakespeare's direct source for Pericles.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is it Artemis who demands the sacrifice of Iphigenia?
Yes.
In order so that the ships can sail again, because they defied her order and they hunted the deer, right? They killed her deer.
Actually, what they did was they tore apart a pregnant rabbit. The twin eagles that represent Menelaus and Agamemnon, okay? The war party leaders tore apart a pregnant rabbit, and that offended Artemis, and that's when she demanded the sacrifice of the daughter.
Which begins the whole Oresteia sequence, right?
Oh, no.
Like Agamemnon ends up dead because of that instance, right? Like Clytemnestra's like, no, man, I will never forgive you for sacrificing our daughter, and I will get my revenge. And then revenge leads to revenge, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that is deeply embedded in that whole narrative. But then you have Euripides, who writes a separate play about Iphigenia, in which Iphigenia is saved. Their sacrifice is substituted, a deer is substituted for her, and she ends up being the head of the Artemis cult in another island, at Taurus, I think.
Yes, there's Iphigenia at Taurus and there's Iphigenia at Aulis.
Yeah, and there's the Taurus one that is more comedic in the sense that, Orestes arrives, they're supposed to kill him and Pylades, and yet the three of them escape, in a boat, and they get out of Dodge and out of trouble. So he wrote two completely different subsequent narratives that involved Iphigenia. So, he was taking the same kind of liberties that Shakespeare later takes in creating characters that are similar in some ways and then diverge.
When Stella is old enough, I've always wanted to do that play. I've always wanted to do Iphigenia. I think it's a magnificent play. There's a wonderful Greek film version of it, by the way, if you want to find
Irina
it.
Papas as Clytemnestra.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's you don't have to understand. The subtitles are enough. The acting is so solid, and the girl who plays Iphigenia is just when she turns to her father and she says, "Okay, I'll go. I'll do it," and he says, "Okay, I'll take you," and she says, "No, I'm a woman now. I can do this on my own," and leaves him behind. And you're just like, and up she goes to the temple, So someday when Stella's old enough, that's a production for my daughter and I to do. I'll play Agamemnon and she can play Iphigenia. Annie, you can play Clytemnestra. It'll be a family affair. That'll be awesome. That'll be an awesome production. Yeah. Before Annie gets to her next question about the book, I did want to mention because this is the history that I know. Throughout the history of my knowing you, which now is almost 20 years, believe it or not, because we first met in Pasadena.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's been like
2012.
18 years ago now?
It's more like 13, but it's close enough.
Okay. It was before I knew you, and I've known you for 15 years. So it had to be before that.
Well, wherever
anyway,
it was, Stephen.
You have consistently over the years mentioned Tanya Pollard.
Yes.
And I feel like you have this like secret love affair with her going on. And I want to know more about that. And I think the listeners want to know more about that because you actually have been in contact with each other multiple times, haven't you?
We have.
Well, and that's actually funny that you mentioned that, Stephen, because I really wanted to pin back to your reference to Tanya Pollard because you mentioned that book. And of course, my brain immediately goes to, that's next on my reading list. I need to read that, right? The, what is it? The Greek women on Shakespeare's stage?
Tragic women on Shakespearean stages.
Yes, that sounds compelling. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, she was clearly influenced by the people who believe that Euripides actually was a Shakespeare source. And she focuses on Hecuba through the first part of her book, but also gets into Iphigenia and Hermione and, the other interesting characters that show these parallels. She does cite my work and Andrew Worth's publications. And she actually says that perhaps I did more work of looking at the mythopoetic origins in The Winter's Tale than any other author, but that did not prove that the Earl of Oxford wrote The Winter's Tale. So she offers a disclaimer in her book, but
it thinks the lady doth protest too much.
But it did show, it shocked me that I could get recognition in a really scholarly edition. She cataloged all the print editions from the various European houses and publication of for 100 years of Greek drama, a Greek epic, other things like that. So the appendices in her book shows you how deep she went in looking for various elements and sources, of knowledge in terms of who knew the plays of Euripides in England during that time. She does not touch on the question of Sophocles and Oedipus and whether that was influential or Aeschylus. She doesn't mention them in any regard, but she focuses exclusively on Euripides in this edition. And so naturally, I was inclined to send her a letter congratulating her and honoring the fact that she recognized so much more beyond what I had identified as a Euripidean influence on Shakespeare's plays that affected a number of other plays besides the ones I had been studying. And she wrote a very respectful letter back and forth. We exchanged letters for about a year in there. And then I kind of went silent because I was still working on some other things. And finally I got around, I got my book together. And I sent her an email, said, well, would you be interested in seeing what I've compiled in the collection of essays? It includes the stories that I evolved on Hamlet, Macbeth, Titus, thank you very much, Stephen. Timon of Athens, Much Ado, Winter's Tale, Pericles, and Midsummer Night's Dream, and also some information on Shakespeare's medical knowledge. And she was actually versed. She had published a book on drug use in the Renaissance, so she was very familiar with so much of the stuff that I was familiar with. And I sent her my book and wondered if she would offer me a comment or a return. I have not yet heard from her. It's been a few months, but nonetheless, she's out there. And no, she's not working the other aspects of Greek influence on Shakespeare right now. She has other topics of interest. Very strong feminist teacher, and I can understand that completely. But she's beautiful, and she's appeared on PBS on some of the commentaries on Shakespeare's plays, on various teaching panels about Shakespeare. She's extremely well spoken. I did suggest that she might join us in New Haven since she got her both undergraduate and her PhD. She was a Rhodes Scholar. That shows you how far up the line of academic achievement she started from the very beginning. So total respect and total admiration for the work that she's done. And I'm not sure that I'll ever hear from her again, but I'm certainly satisfied that I used her ideas to enhance some of my own and to gain some additional authority beyond the fact that I'm a doctor who didn't study this whole field of literature until my 60s. So 25 years of immersion. Yeah. I got a little something here.
Yes.
And I wanted to share that with the world. Now, I had reviewed 3 different books, one by Jonathan Bate and one by a series of Greek editors and another by Colin Burrow. Bate and Burrow were both acknowledged experts on Shakespeare and the classics. Bate's book, How the Classics Made Shakespeare, and Burrow's book was about Shakespeare and the classics. And neither of them can acknowledge any Greek influence. Burrow says, and he's an Oxford Don, Burrow says Shakespeare learned about Greek drama from Plutarch. Plutarch has everything that he needed to know about Greek drama. And then Bate says, well, really, it's about Shakespeare and Ovid. Ovid taught Shakespeare about the characterization and enters into his tragicomedies and all these sort of things. And it was from Plutarch that he gained the spirit of Greek drama. So both of them were still in the early 2000s publishing books on Shakespeare and the classics that did not mention the Greek sources that other scholars like Tanya Pollard, Lili Schleiner, and a handful of knowledgeable people who are familiar with the classics were willingly admitting at this point.
They also don't mention that Plutarch and Ovid were only available in Latin at that time. They kind of gloss over that fact too, right? So they're like, oh no, there was no Greek influence other than these two guys. But P.S., the only way that William of Stratford could have accessed these two guys is if he was fluent in Latin, which he obviously could not have been. So they just it's the same smokescreen over and over again with these types of guys, isn't it?
Well, I think I can justify their defense of Latin sources within Shakespeare. I think the Greek grammar school, the Stafford Grammar School, they taught Latin grammar there. They didn't teach Greek, but they did teach Latin grammar, and that's the educational system focused on that kind of thing and rhetoric and all that. And it was preparatory to send people off to the universities where they would become either ministers or doctors or lawyers. You kind of had three career choices when you went to advanced education. Well, maybe he was familiar enough to be able to read some Latin. We know he couldn't his handwriting was terrible. So maybe he didn't even sign the documents of the 6 signatures we have, that may have been signed by scribes who were working on the legal documents themselves. So we know he didn't know how to write, but he might have been able to read Latin. He might have been able to read pretty decent English, and certainly he had some kind of a role in the Lord Chamberlain's men, the King's men. His name is mentioned in the cast list, and his name is mentioned in some other documents that confirm that he was in the money stream. I think he was a producer. I think he owned costumes. He probably owned sets. He had a piece of the company so that he would get a cut of the gate for various productions that were put on in the public stages. And so I think he had some kind of minor role, and I do believe he may have had some Latin. But certainly the fact that his parents were illiterate and that his daughters were both basically illiterate, and he came from a household that had no books mentioned in any of the documents that refer to New Place. And, he had a son-in-law who was a fine physician who kept copious notes and mentioned the other notables in that part of England that were his patients, but never referred to his famous father-in-law who was so knowledgeable in medicine, not once.
That's kind of odd, right?
Yeah. So the absence of evidence that points to a literary life is sufficient for me, but I can't argue that he might not have been able to read Latin or English text. I think maybe he was smart enough to be able to do that.
I always like looking at, the influence of women, being a woman myself, right? And you touch multiple times in your book upon the education of, or you basically being a Greek scholar for Mildred Cecil, which was fascinating to me. I don't know too much about Mildred Cecil at all, but, just to know that a noblewoman of that time could actually even have that level of an education is fascinating to me. And you look at, so that you talked about the parallels of Anne Cecil as Oxford's wife, but then also the influence of Mildred Cecil, his mother-in-law, and you go, wow, incredible, dynamic, educated, right? Obviously the Greek connection. And then you look at the connection of the Stratford man and the women in his life, and it's just such a stark contrast. Yeah. And you go, how could it even be possible at all that, this man here with this, no real strong connection to the women in his life that we can tell have written all of these incredible female characters. That's always been my interest, right?
I'm also going to guess, there's no way of knowing this, but from reports and from letters and things that we do have, Mildred Cecil was like a taskmaster. Yes. She ran a tight ship. She would talk about pure Calvinist Puritans, right? And I'm going to just take a guess and say that on one occasion or more, she beat the hell out of the Earl of Oxford and some of those other wards, right? Like bent them over the bedstand with a stick and whacked the hell out of those young boys who disrupted her household or messed with her library or ran through her roses or whatever. I have these images of her being like, you pow, right? You just, don't you think maybe?
I laugh at this. The tyranny of Mildred Cecil. Well, I do know that she's greatly admired for her organizational ability and admired for her literary abilities. She had editions there's documents of the Greek edition she owned and was noted. I think Roger Osham said that she knew Greek as well as she knew English.
Wow.
And George Buchanan, who did the Latin translation of the Alcestis and published in Paris, and of course was in the library, he wrote poetry to Mildred Cecil. And she received 4 or 5 literary dedications in her life. lifetime, but was greatly acknowledged, along with her sisters, as being a practicing empiric medical practitioner, in addition to being a woman highly knowledgeable about in Greek literature and particularly Greek biblical text. St. John Chrysostom was one of her great interests. And so the fact that her daughter received 2 dedications of these sermons related to St. John Chrysostom, which were in Greek originally and then translated into English and dedicated to Anne Cecil anonymously, makes it interesting. Was it Mildred who translated that, or was it the Earl trying to regain credence and acceptability within the Cecil family who did that translation? Hard to know, because both of them were versed in it. And I think Roger Strittmatter's work, looking at the Audley End annotations, and that the forensic handwriting analysis of these copious, over 1,000 marginal notes in the Cassius Dio History of Rome, and those notations and annotations relate specifically to images, scenes, and dramaturgy in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. I mean, Roger's work on this is really breaking through, and he got a mainstream publisher to take a look at the unknown annotator of the Audley End editions and agree that the handwriting seemed to match the handwriting of the Earl of Oxford, a high probability that those were his annotations.
That's fascinating.
And we don't know the provenance of these Greek editions that were in the Audley End library. And we can thank the people who were actually interested in Henry Neville as an authorship candidate, John Casson and Bill Rubenstein, who published their book on this and included these passages. And our dear friend Jan Scheffer, who's my buddy that I've been rooming with at all the conferences in recent years, a Dutch scholar who's on the De Vere Society board, tells Roger Strittmatter, Roger, you should go to Audley End and look at these because they claim that these are the annotations by Henry Neville. But I don't think it looks like Henry Neville's handwriting from what the samples I've seen that they've published. But it sure looks like maybe the Earl of Oxford's handwriting. Now, maybe you should check into this since, you looked into De Vere's Bible and you know more about his handwriting and the letters he wrote than anybody else in the world. Go look. And so 3 years ago, Roger began exploring the stunning collection of annotated editions, of which he found 4 that had annotations that maybe were worthy of investigation further. But the richest one is the History of Rome that stretches during the period of time in which Antony, Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar were part of the historical context, and the details that are in Cassius Dio that show up as noteworthy annotations in the margins. And he wrote in both Latin, most of them, 90% of the annotations were in Latin, but 10% of them were written in Greek characters.
Wow.
And to have Nick Panagopoulos jumping into the fray at this point from the point of view of what's going on in Athens and appreciating the possibility that we have really amounts to a shotgun blast, not just a smoking gun, but a blast that shows an incredible new source for Shakespeare's Roman tragedies that had been previously unrecognized and untranslated, and seemed to be, at one time, in the possession of the man whose handwriting matches that of the Earl of Oxford. Now, that's a series of logical connections that you can accept or reject, but I think the implications are stronger than ever that where I've been pursuing this from the point of view of what's in the drama that looks Greeky, Roger has pursued it from what looks like handwriting and annotated classical editions of Roman history that reflect on the canon in specific images that Shakespeare seems to be using this as one of his primary sources.
Right.
And see, now I have this vision in my head of Roger in this like dusty library with these white gloves on his hands, flipping through the pages of these old tomes, making the discovery and having to keep the tears from falling onto the pages of the book.
Yes. I mean, he gives great credit to the library itself for allowing their access. He's been, I think, 3 different times with Shelley and taken thousands of pictures of these annotated pages and, used it and published a 50-page article in a journal for forensic handwriting analysis. So he's taken it from the position of, does this handwriting match Henry Neville, or is it much closer to the Earl of Oxford? And so he can move the pointer toward the Earl of Oxford, rather than where
Right.
Casson and Rubinstein had stumbled upon these editions, which were in the possession of Henry Neville's family lived in Essex, not more than 10 or 15 miles from Heddington Castle, in the possessions of the Earl of Oxford. So what the provenance is on those books is uncertain, and that's a great regret that we can't prove that, unlike the Geneva Bible, which
Right.
has the actual imprint, or Oxford's edition of the Storia d'Italia that he bought when he was in Italy, that has an imprint of the Earl of Oxford on the cover. So you have certain editions he owned, but he didn't put a lot of written annotations in that Geneva Bible. But unlike that, there are copious, over 1,000, I think Roger has said, at our conferences. And most of the stuff, if you go to shakespearebible.com or .org, his website, you will find links to the articles he's written and to the videos he's produced, pointing out all these parallels from those oddly annotated editions, and the miracle of him stumbling upon this through a web of connection that goes back through Jan Scheffer and other people affiliated with the doubter community that are raising, the
doubter
bed
community.
Yeah.
I
Us.
love it. Yes,
Us.
absolutely.
Otherwise known as the Quiller Nation.
Yes, you bet, Stephen.
I love it. A new rabbit hole to dive into. Great.
No,
Just what you all need.
I think the popular media, the podcasting, and some of the videos that have been produced, by various artists, and there are several new ones that are coming out in the coming year. Cheryl Egan Donovan is working on one, All the World's a Stage, and it looks really good. I happen to think I might make the final cut. I don't know. I'm hoping,
Great.
So she's going to be showing it around at some of our episodes of conferences and websites in the coming year. And an English filmmaker, Eilish, Amanda Eilish, has done an amazing job, and she comes at it from the point of view of the dynamic succession theories that many of our colleagues have embraced, that Henry Risley was the unacknowledged royal bastard of Queen Elizabeth via De Vere, and that the pregnancy portrait is actually a picture of Elizabeth that was commissioned, so she takes that point of view, but she interviews a lot of different very interesting people, and lovely talks with Hank Whittemore and Sir Derek Jacobi and Richard Clifford, other people. Yeah.
We were both just recently Zoom attendees of the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable presentations. I noticed you on there on the list of Zoomers in. And we've had, of course, Carol Sue has been a guest in the past of the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable, but Michael Delahoyde, who's also been a guest in past episodes, he gave a presentation on portraiture of Elizabeth. And I had to laugh out loud because he got into this he kind of painted himself into a corner in the middle of his presentation where he's like, well, actually, if you look at it from this perspective, it kind of does look like there's a pregnancy going on here. And it kind of does look like there's some stuff pointing to what we would call the PT theory, but I don't want to be in that camp. I don't want to be named as what I was like, you're talking about protesting too much. Come on, Michael, just embrace it. It's all right there. You have no choice. You just embrace it.
He's on that razor's edge, Stephen. I know how he's tempted by this. I've known Michael for my entire involvement with this. He's always came as a guest lecturer at the Concordia conferences and is such a dynamic guy. And he's a sweet colleague. He plays wonderful jazz piano, and he would go to nursing homes and do entertainment, in the late afternoons and just pick up on their grand pianos. And so his degrees are actually in music and in Chaucer. He has, I think, a master's in music, but he's a master of the keyboard and really enjoys the musical element of this. And there's a delightful guy. And of course, he was part of our teaching faculty when we've had seminars here in Ashland during the time the summer seminars were before pre-COVID,
Right.
And having a great time seeing plays and getting the locals educated. And you were a big part of that last time that we did it, 2019, I think, Stephen. And we had so much fun, and we got front page coverage in the local newspapers, and spread the word widely. And we took over one of the Shakespeare theaters, for a couple hours and ran our sets, and had some fun down at Hannon Library. the fact that you and Annie have moved to Southern Oregon and created the Shakespeare culture that you have with a community in your part of this valley, this beautiful Applegate area. The two shows they put on this past summer, Comedy of Errors and Annie as an unbelievably wonderful and compelling Hamlet.
Oh, thank you, Earl.
Were just outstanding. And, so they're spreading the virus quite openly and vigorously.
The virus.
And within the canon itself, converting people who are actively engaged in loving Shakespeare and learning the plays and in doing the readings of the literature that surrounds our interests and capacities. And this is what's been driven into me, the inspiration, the idea that there's something fresh and new that you could explore within Shakespeare, even after an immersion in this for half your lifetime.
All the time, right?
Yeah.
It never really ends. I know. I see your copy of the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt hanging behind us now, Earl. Stephen got his framed, and he's going to start having it up at an easel at all of the performance he's telling me. So okay, all right, we're going to start working that into each component of our Shakespeare festival now.
We already put an ad for the podcast in our programs every year.
Yes.
And then when John Shahan was here the last time, and I think he paid a visit to you as well while he was here. Well, he gifted me one of those full-size poster images of the Declaration, and I just recently acquired the proper frame for it. And so I promised him that we'll display it at every performance now.
Perfect.
And then, of course, he sent me an email with the smaller version, like the pamphlet version that I can print and have those available on the registration tables next to our program. So when people see it, if they're really curious, they can take a pamphlet home with them and really read about it and figure it out. So one spreading the word, one skeptic at a time.
Oh, that was beautiful, beautiful story, Stephen. In 2010, we actually had a Declaration signing event, and this poster is from that. And we had the executive director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, Paul Nicholson, signed it. The artistic director of Portland Center Stage, now the Denver Community Center Stage, signed it. The artistic director of Camelot Theater, Elizabeth Janice at the time, signed it.
Oh, wow.
The artistic director from the theater in Carmel, the Shakespeare Festival in Carmel, he signed it. Stevens did. And so we had all these theater people signing it, and then Hank Whittemore signed it, and then we had an academic sign it. So we had a spectrum of theater arts people and actors, and Jamie Newcomb and Chris Duvall both signed that edition during that time, 2010. And Michael Cecil was part of our community at that time, Lord Burleigh, who had been converted by conversations with me that were, again, the perfect happenstance of saying the right thing at the right time at the right place with the right people.
Yes.
I mean,
that's how it works.
It was my first year of studying Shakespeare. And I was immersed in my paper writing about Hamlet and learning about the English Renaissance for the first time and excited about the possibilities of what would lay before me. And I went out and had a little gathering with a couple of physician and another community activist who were interested in setting up a community volunteer service for transporting seniors. And as an emergency physician, what would I know and help to guide their ideas and decision-making and all this sort of stuff. So we met up at this pub and downtown Ashland, where my friend Jim was playing piano jazz. So it was the most felicitous environment, and we had some sips in our ale. And they said, "Well, what are you doing, Earl, these days? Now that you've been retired for 6 months." I said, "Oh, I'm deep into studying Shakespeare and the English Renaissance, and I'm so excited. I'm working on a paper on Hamlet right now, and it's classical sources, and I'm learning about the influence of so many fascinating people like William Cecil and Earl of Oxford." And my friend Robin, Dr. Miller, says, "Earl, you know who you're talking to?" Barbara. "Oh, Barbara Cecil. Oh, excuse me. Barbara, are you related?" "I happen to be married to the Marquis of Exeter, Earl. My husband is Lord Burleigh." Oh my God.
That's just incredible. Mind blown. Yeah.
So I did the right thing. I praised him. Mm-hmm. Rather than giving the Oxfordian line as he's my tortured father-in-law that wouldn't give me a dime, So I said the right thing at the right time, got invited to tea at their house, saw his original version of the precepts, the original copy that Michael possessed. And he joined their community in beautiful, lightweight ways, came to Concordia and spoke there, and was filmed on Cheryl Egan Donovan's 2000 her documentary, Nothing is Truer Than Truth. So he gives testimony there. But it was based on his curiosity and interest and belief now, because he did the reading, and he's an intelligent person, the Marquess of Exeter, very, 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 very well-informed person. And in his own gentle way, he acknowledged us and blessed us. It was really a wonderful thing to have him part of our.
He filmed a presentation that was then delivered at Hatfield House at a De Vere Society event a couple years ago that I was at.
Yes,
about the precepts, about his great, how many greats there are there, but also like the family motto that is sort of lampooned in the original texts of Hamlet, and it was a fascinating presentation. And he was very. I would say very committed to the idea that definitely William Cecil is the prototype of Polonius, and that only the only one who could have known that and could have written it that way would have been the Earl of Oxford.
Oh, absolutely. I think he has actually. I did visit Cecil House up in. The north of England with Kevin Gilvary, and we were given a kind of a backstage passes by John Culverhouse, who was the manager there that knows Michael and the family, and it was very friendly with us. I shared with him the information about Anne Cecil being an empiric medical practitioner and provided the documentation. He was unaware of that, actually.
Oh, yeah.
So that was kind of exciting for him, and we got a chance to kind of traipse around and see that magnificent. Extraordinary big house up there in northern England. So, we're so lucky to have those kind of people still around that are willing to open their hearts and minds, and willing to even consider the wisdom of challenging authority in a gentle and respectful way, and we like that to predominate. But of course, we're met with ridicule, in so many different times and places. So, you've all been through that fair share of it. I've had very little of it. In fact, being teaching for a dozen years at the Lifelong Learning Program on the authorship question, I never was made to feel uncomfortable by somebody in class getting upset and angry and storming out, at the last second. No, mostly people will listen respectfully, because I treat the canon respectfully and I treat the family as respectfully as I can on all stages. I'm not a true believer in the Prince Tudor narrative, but I think that there's many of my most admirable companions on this path have kind of gone that way, and I just still have to I have to read what they write about it all.
Sure, of course.
So, I can be swayed.
All the knowledge.
I can be swayed away, but I think the fact is that after really being immersed in this for a quarter of a century now, I find it confirming more and more confirmed year after year after year with the new research that's being published, with the new books that are pointing out all the deficiencies in the traditional narrative and all the overreaction of the Academy to what we're challenging them with, particularly, the wonderful book, Shakespeare was a woman and other, such a brilliant summary that Elizabeth Winkler wrote. It was everybody who's in the nation, every Quiller needs to have an extra copy of that.
Absolutely.
And pass it on to a friend, because it gives you the historical context better than any other source that I could recommend.
I've actually been finding that Elizabeth's book has sort of taken the prime position when it comes to books that people reference to me as introducing them to this topic. For the longest time, it was Charlton Ogburn's book.
Yes.
Right. And that was the one. That was the go-to. What made you become an Oxfordian, or what made you doubt Shakespeare authorship? Oh, Charlton Ogburn. Then, of course, it was Mark Anderson's book. Yep. And that one sort of reigned supreme for a very long time. And now it's Elizabeth Winkler's book is the one that is cited most often to me by newcomers to this as having brought them to the question.
Yeah, no.
I think it's also one of the, easiest ones to pass on to people who are curious too, to get them even further interested in it. Because she's a very compelling writer, and it's so obviously imbued with research and education, but it's not so, knee deep in a lot of the research, and that it's overwhelming for people, right? It's nice for newcomers. It's not completely overwhelming. If they can dive deeper, if they want to dive deeper, there are plenty of ways that they can dive deeper, but it's a great introduction to it.
She takes you like on a tour,
right?
Of the
Exactly.
whole thing, you know.
Exactly.
And each chapter has its own special, unique way of doing it, and it's like, oh, we're going to go to Stratford. What's that going to be like? You know, what's it like with having tea with Stanley Wells, making him so uncomfortable? He says these outrageous things, and then on the train back, I'm just shaking my head, wondering about that. And then the details she puts in there that capture something of the personality of the people. She's actually a wonderful writer in that regard.
Absolutely, she is.
And very generous. We had a chance to spend some time in New Orleans a couple of years ago together, and I got to be on a panel with her and Roz Barber and two professors from Tulane in the theater arts and English departments. And it's like, you know, she was the MC of the session that we had this discussion of the authorship question. And it was like, this is the best, you know, and I hope the whole world wakes up to the fact that there's something quite fascinating and quite subversive and something very credible going on here when it comes to the challenging.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the fact is, you know, you can quietly know what's going on and not advertise it too much because it makes people so uncomfortable who are so committed to the traditional narrative.
Right.
Yeah. And we can manage that. But what you guys are doing, what Stephen's doing with the podcast and what you're doing with your theater company is just a marvelous new addition that's made living in Southern Oregon even a better place to be. If you love Shakespeare, come during the summertime when Stephen is, the Rogue Theater Companies, doing their things, and the Shakespeare Festival is going on, where you can get total immersion on here, but don't miss it coming out to the Applegate, tasting some really good wine and seeing some wonderful community theater because it is a great show.
Oh, thank you, Earl.
It's just a really, I was very impressed this year, and I'm a discerning critic, believe me.
Of course you are. I was nervous. I was like, oh gosh, Earl's in the audience. He knows more about Hamlet than anybody else who's going to come see this play.
Well, you know, one of the things that we didn't get into that I want to just mention in passing is artistic license that Shakespeare enjoyed.
Right.
That he could ridicule the Queen as Titania in love with this monstrous ass-headed creature, you know, and bold series of allusions that the insiders at court, the English court, the French court would all know was a mockery of this romance that she carried on with the Duke d'Alençon to keep the French from aligning with the Spanish during the run up to the war with Spain, you know, and the way she manipulated the whole thing and how Shakespeare integrates scenes from their romance into this play that is absolutely hysterical. And that's the shocking thing, that it's credible, it's beautiful, it's well developed by a number of people writing about this going back into the early 20th century. And yet, when you look at classical editions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the reference to this is being so subversive that you can't consider that Shakespeare might have been able to get away with, while the Queen was still alive, writing a play that mocked her for her, you know, infatuation with these French dignitaries, you know?
Well, that was a great part of your book too, right? The whole section on Midsummer Night's Dream, the connection to the birds, Aristophanes. That was another that I had studied in college as well. Aristophanes, the old comedy. We did a section on the old comedy into the new comedy, and we did read Aristophanes. We did read some portions of the birds. You know, I was again digging deep into my, you know, brain of going, okay, yes, I do have some reference, some knowledge here, but you captured so well with that, you know, the connection to the Greek, all of the references, the connections to Aristophanes, but then connection to that current event at that time and how he all ties it up so beautifully in what has become the most popular comedy ever, you know.
I mean, this is a bomb ready to go off someday, you know?
Right, exactly.
Really, I mean, some smart journalists gotta have to say, my God, look at the parallels here. You
exactly.
know? You know, Peter Quince and the ambassador to Kansas.
Oh yeah, that was fascinating to read about. I loved that connection. Yeah.
Well, and then also when we look at the historical dating of that play, and even mainstream scholars look at it and say, well, it appears as though it first premiered at the wedding of William Stanley to Elizabeth de Vere.
Yeah.
And, ding, ding, ding. Hello. I mean, do you need any more connections? Do you need anything else to go on?
Well, this is one theory. The other one would be the Countess of Southampton and her wedding, which was a spring wedding or a May wedding. So the idea of this is a summer festival and a summer, fantasy might not comply with a winter wedding, but certainly we love that possible connection that scholars have independently identified that. This is written as an epithalamium. This is a wedding play. Yes. This is about love and marriage. Yes. Because everybody's going to get married in the end, It's like it's all going to work out. It's
triple wedding. At the end. Yeah.
And I didn't make that connection, and none of the very smart Shakespeare classical scholars that I had read had identified Aristophanes as a source, because Aristophanes' comedies were topical. Right. They were about the corruption in Athens during that time, and he could write quite openly and get away with it. I mean, Cleon tried to sue him for defamation in the Knights and several other plays, and he lost in court. Aristophanes always prevailed. Artistic license for the comedies was completely open. You could openly criticize the leadership for their corruption and for whatever else that they were guilty of, So the idea that that's a possibility really was exciting to me, because Shakespeare seems to have exhibited that in this one particular play, for sure, let alone Polonius and Hamlet and other plays like that. So, but Rick Wagaman, Dr. Rick Wagaman, who's published many wonderful articles in the psychoanalytic literature and Shakespeare and the level of denial and what that represents, in terms of our psychology, sent me an article in which an independent scholar had identified a scene from the Birds in which the chorus is awakened by a bird song. And the bird song that is in Midsummer Night's Dream, when Bottom starts singing and suddenly the fairies start all showing up, that she drew parallels between those two scenes. And I said, well, there's something interesting going on here. And then I looked at all the bird references in Dream. And my God, every bird mentioned in Midsummer Night's Dream is also in Aristophanes' The Birds. And then I realized, this is the one play of Aristophanes in which there's actually a metamorphosis of a character. These guys will sprout wings, just like Bottom sprouts an ass's head. So there's something completely unique about both of these plays that have to do with the dramaturgy and the transformative metamorphic power, that is embedded in this. And then that sucks you down deeper and deeper into it, and you realize there's a lot of aspects of these two plays that are worthy of comparison, and maybe The Birds in some regards. And, we know that Thomas Smith put on the plays of Aristophanes at Cambridge in the 1530s and 1540s. And he had those plays in a folio edition in his library during the time the Earl of Oxford was living with him.
There you go.
What wouldn't interest the Earl of Oxford more than the comedies of this fabulous, writer, Aristophanes,
Yes. Yeah, so, absolutely.
Anyway,
well,
it came
very
again
fascinating.
Because of the web we all live in.
Right.
I got the lead, and then I carried it to a finish line. And that's really what I believe the metaphor that I could use for what I lived for the last 20, 25 years is I found a golden thread, and I found other golden threads, and we wove them into a tapestry that creates a template of consciousness, of interest and fascination with a Greek root that has been unrecognized and denied for way, way too long. And that now we have scholars who are shaking that tree down, and those golden apples are going to fall on somebody. And we'll get a breakthrough in terms of looking at how serious is Shakespeare.
Not the silver thread of Pyramus. Not that thread. Not the silver thread. Come thread, come cut and thrum, he says, as he's trying to kill himself. Right?
That is a beautiful analogy, though, Earl. I think that's a great way to put it, and I think that sums it up very nicely. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, it was a wonderful read. I loved diving into it. Like I said, it opened up further areas of exploration now for me. I definitely want to pick up a copy of Tanya Pollard's book. I want to go revisit the Greeks and, see for myself, read for myself all of these connections that you've made. So very, very fascinating read. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, I'm so happy for you, for your love of this story, this series of stories that just came out of my love of the theater and my inspiration that I received from watching great drama, and the fact that this is a religious level experience of life, of transformation and acceptance and belief, and your ability to pull in the full human experience, and the draw that has, and the drama is part of that religious tradition. And the singing and the chanting and all of it is part of the richest, oldest tradition in which humans clung to each other in creating belief systems that sustained them and made their lives meaningful.
Well, it is called Shakespeare's Greater Greek. And as long as I've known you, I've always called you the Greek master of the movement. There have been so many members, and we've even mentioned some of them here in this episode, that have come to prominence, as it were, for their various areas of study that they have pursued. Obviously Roger will forever be known as the Bible guy, right? Like that's just, he's got to own it. He's claimed it. He owns it. Kevin will always be known as the dating guy, right? The dating the plays. Everyone, so many have like come upon their niche, I think dating back to like episode 1 or episode 2 or 3, Bonner is always going to be the will lady, right? Like Shakespeare's will, and her knowledge of the wills of that day and of that time period too. It's not just Shakespeare's will, but all the context that she provides because of the study that she has done. So, this is your niche, but I think that you can't quite yet calculate, and time will tell, because the book's only been out for a little over 6 months. Time will tell how momentous this is going to be in Shakespeare scholarship, though, Earl. I think it's going to make a huge difference moving forward. And I can't wait to hear if you get a response from Tanya Pollard. I hope you do. But I also think that there are a lot of other scholars who need this book in their hands and need to read it. And then I challenge them to refute it, right? I challenge that it will not change their concepts of where Shakespeare derives from and how can they explain it. I don't know that they can. I've done a lot of episodes with a lot of scholars on the Italian sources, which I think is another area that's so difficult to explain. But when you combine these two together, it absolutely, if it proves nothing else, it proves to me that the man from Stratford is absolutely not the right candidate.
Irrefutably.
Absolutely. I love how you mentioned, right, the connection, how theater, dramatic arts it's like it's its own religion, has its own connection to religion. When Stephen and I were in Europe, just a month ago, actually, we were in Sète, and we went to the Molière Theater, and we went and toured, and then we walked out, and Stephen turns to me and he's like, I had this feeling like I needed to genuflect, like I needed to get down on my knees and cross myself and go, I'm in this sacred space. And I'm like, I felt compelled to do the same, and Stephen and I are Catholic, and we love going to all of the different cathedrals and everything when we're traveling, but then we feel this same compelling need to worship, almost to feel like we're in this sacred space when we're in a theater, because that's what it is. It feels like, we're in this tremendously sacred space, and that's what the theater does for us, and that's what the dramatic places do. And you're absolutely right in that sense. It's its own connection to religion. It's beautiful.
They are temples of their own right.
Exactly.
And I think that our author recognized the theater as being a temple. And I think in A Midsummer Night's Dream, you see that too, right? Like the Duke's palace is next to the temple. And that's where they're going to now go and perform their play for the Duke on his wedding day at night, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, the Dionysia were religious festivals.
Yes.
And they were competitions too. The Greeks love to compete.
Yes, right. Look at them. They look at the Olympics.
Right,
yeah.
right. They would put aside their war weapons.
Right.
They would declare a truce long enough to run the Olympics and then go back and pick up their arms and go back to war.
That's just incredible.
And he wouldn't do it during the harvest season because they got busy,
Yeah, right.
I mean, everything was done in this ritualized kind of form.
Yes.
And so, there was a reverence and a community unity around the decision to do these things. And so you would have mostly males, of course, in the audience who were citizens, and then maybe some, foreigners who were visiting, bureaucrats or whatever, in this magnificent, huge theater. And day after day, you would see trilogies and then a satyr play by the top 4 or 5 playwrights. That week you'd spend in complete immersion in these narratives, and mostly would come from mythopoetic literature. Some reflected more historical stuff that could get you into trouble. I know that Phrynichus was fined a year's labor for insulting an Athenian family by writing a play about the Persian War that didn't compliment this particular family. So you could be subject to punishment if you wrote the wrong things. But there was a festive, absolute, sacred ritual quality to the whole thing. And then, of course, the winners of the competitions were recorded in tablets. And, you could see how many times Aeschylus won, how many times Sophocles or Euripides might have triumphed in the tragedies competitions. So there was some spirited competition and religious fervor and national or civic identity, all tied in a time in which, like England triumphing over the Spanish Armada and a small Protestant nation defeating a Catholic monster that was coming after them repeatedly, is paralleled by the Greeks' rejection of the Persian invasions in 490 and 480, and that Xerxes and Darius were both sent scurrying with their tails between their legs in a defeated million-man army. The Athenians stood up with the Spartans, and then at the end of the Peloponnesian War, it was Lysander, the general or the admiral of the Spartan fleet, who said, "We won't burn Athens and kill all the women and children and put the men into slavery. We'll just simply change their form of government." And so Lysander saved Athens from destruction. The Thebans wanted to burn it, and that's why he's a character in Midsummer Night's Dream.
There you go. Well, your knowledge is just incredible, Earl. It's been wonderful to listen to you talk about it. I mean, obviously reading the book, but then getting this wonderful opportunity to hear you speak about everything you know. I mean, it's just at this point, it's utter nonsense in my brain to think that Shakespeare did not have connections to the Greek literature and the Greek plays. It's obvious now in my mind. So thank you for putting this out there, and thank you for taking the time to talk to Stephen and I about it. And again, your wealth of knowledge is just incredible. Could listen to you for hours.
Well, there you have it. Quiller Nation, our friend Earl Showerman, his great new book, Shakespeare's Greater Greek. Go find it on Amazon, and don't listen to him. Yes, listen to him about having extra copies of Elizabeth Winkler's book, but you should have extra copies of Earl's book as well, because especially if you know any theater artists, if you know any theater people at all, that it's a book that theater people need to have, because we cannot embrace this craft, we cannot embrace this art without looking back. They call us thespians after all, so without looking all the way back to the origins. And the great Thespis, and then the masters who came afterwards. And it's crazy to believe that this author wouldn't do the same as an artist, and is obviously someone who's passionate about theater art particularly. And I think that you, above anybody, have connected that together, Earl. So it's going to make a difference. It's going to be, you have built a monument to yourself, sir.
Stephen, you honor me in ways I hardly ever would have expected to have created somehow relationships in my lifetime. In this period of, the last years of my life have been more enriched by this engagement and knowing people like yourselves and other colleagues, and knowing how courageous it is to go out there and stand before the people and tell them a story they may not want to hear. and at the end of the play, laugh and joyfully join in the celebration of life, which is encompassed in the theatrical experience. We are, I was in emergency medicine, which one of my presidents called show business for the unfortunate. Okay, so I've been in the same art as you guys. And the same field of interest and study in historical reference. And I'm amazed, Stephen, at the amazing breadth of knowledge that you possess when you have your various interviews on completely extraneous and different topics in which you've obviously done some background reading and prepared yourself for those interviews like a good journalist. I praise you for that contribution. I'm not agreeing with every idea that comes forward from your people, but I do appreciate that you give voice and allow people to have that opportunity to come forward and use reflect on their imagination, and then in time perhaps they'll come more around to thinking something very different.
I've been very proud that over this last year, and this is the beginning of the 8th season now of Don't Quill the Messenger. And I'm really pleased over the last year, I've been able to make contact with and bring on guests who are deeply rooted in the Stratfordian camp and provide them enough feeling of safety and security that they could come and share their knowledge, their research on the topic, and not feel like I was leading them into some sort of a trap or a gotcha moment. Which I don't believe is what a journalist should do. And I do have a journalism background, so I think that, is part of where it comes from. Also, my mother always taught me be a good host to every guest, and they are my guests. You mentioned earlier, though, and it made me laugh because one of my most recent guests was Professor Richard Schreier from the University of Chicago. And one of the things that he shared with me near the end of the episode when we talked about authorship, because I usually wait till the very end before I throw at least a few obligatory questions at them. But he literally takes the Shapiro position, and he would say, when I was teaching my classes, I would tell my students, you can bring up any idea, you can ask any question, you can talk about any concept, but do not mention authorship to me. And I was like, that's just so sad, Hopefully, maybe as he's retired now, he's professor emeritus now. Hopefully, maybe now he'll start to soften on that position a little bit and at least allow questions to be asked, But I think that that's the key, is providing a platform where open conversation, open discussion, and what I would say intellectual honesty can prevail.
Absolutely, Stephen. And, total respect for the openness and, the fact that you've extended your wings far beyond the initial community that I thought we were going to be dealing with and most of the kinds of input you got. So, you have such an archive of great talks over the years, 8 seasons now. Oh my goodness. I'm so glad I'm still here to enjoy this.
Yeah. Let's see. At time of recording this episode, this is the first episode of season 8. And sans the anniversary episode that Jake and I always do. And there are plenty of guests lined up for this coming season already. The queue is already starting to build. And we now have more than 175 episodes. Those are the regular episodes, plus now more than 20 bonus feature episodes. So yeah, there's quite a library.
Yeah, wow, an archive, a wonderful,
indeed,
wonderful interview archive that somebody at some point in time is going to have to go back and start listening from the get-go and say, "Oh my God, really? They were saying these things?"
Well, they'll find at least 9 episodes featuring Dr. Earl Showerman. So there you go.
Well, I'm a near neighbor and I can threaten them in various ways. Okay, so.
Well, thank you again, Earl, for a wonderful episode. Another delightful conversation. As Annie said, we could probably go on for hours.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Earl. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me to be a part of it as well and get a chance to question Earl on some of the aspects of his book. It's been a pleasure for me as well.
Well, you got to keep the rivalry between you going. So who holds the title for the most episodes? And right now it is currently still a tie. So there you go.
Lovely.
Well, that's it, fellow Quillers. We thank you for joining us. As we said, more episodes to come. And if you need to know more, you know where to go. Don'tQuillThePodcast.com. Don'tQuillThePodcast.com. That's where you will find everything and anything that you need to know Quiller in nature. Shoot me an email if you need to. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. And until we speak again, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.